When my mother laid a velvet box on the dinner table and said, "You're almost 30, so stop being picky," I had no idea the man she was pushing on me hid a terrifying past. He had already walked two women through divorce court, leaving both broke and broken. My parents called him a catch with a high net worth, but my gut screamed that he was a predator looking for his next victim. Refusing to be traded off like a bargaining chip, I began digging into his past. What I uncovered sent shockwaves through our entire community, completely destroying his fake golden reputation. But the real nightmare didn't end when I walked away. 2 years later, he showed up at my doorstep with a wild claim that I was mentally unstable and a desperate plea for me to come home. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments below. My name is Clara, I'm 29 years old, and for the past 4 years, I've been working night and day to build my career as an independent freelance architect. I love my work, designing homes, balancing structures, making sure every foundation is solid. It's what I do. But in my parents' eyes, none of my professional achievements meant a single thing because I didn't have a ring on my finger. My parents, Harold and Eleanor, belong to that old-school line of thinking where a daughter's ultimate success is measured by the tax bracket of the man she marries. For months, Sunday dinners at their house had become an interrogation session. "Your cousin is 24 and already expecting," my mother would sigh, dramatically setting down her teacup. "You're spending all your best years drawing floor plans." Then came the dinner, where everything shifted. I walked into their dining room expecting the usual lectures, but instead, the table was set for 4 with fine china and polished silverware. Sitting across from my father was a man in his late 30s wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly studio rent. "Clara, this is Richard Vance," my father announced, his voice practically booming with pride. Richard just expanded his real estate investment firm into town. Richard stood up, offering a suave, practiced smile. His handshake was firm, his eyes calculating. Throughout the dinner, Richard dominated the conversation. He spoke at length about his developments, his luxury cars, and his high-profile network. My parents ate up every single word. But as I sat there observing him, subtle red flags started popping up like neon signs. Whenever I tried to speak about my architecture firm, Richard would cut in, subtly downplaying my work. "That's cute, Clara. Boutique drafting is a nice hobby, but real estate development is where the real money moves." He had a high-control aura wrapped in slick charisma, and my parents were completely blind to it. Before the dessert was served, my mother slid that velvet box toward me under the table, whispering that Richard was a man of status and that I shouldn't ruin this opportunity. An ultimatum was silently placed on the table: accept Richard's attention or face my family's eternal disappointment. To keep the peace and buy myself some time, I agreed to go on a formal dinner date with Richard that weekend. He picked me up in a sleek sports car and took me to an absurdly expensive steakhouse where the waiters walked on eggshells around him. As the evening wore on, I decided to test his polished exterior. "So, Richard," I said, leaning over my glass of water, "my parents mentioned you were married before. What happened there?" For a fraction of a second, his charming smile flickered into something sharp and cold before he quickly recovered. He took a slow sip of his wine and shook his head with an expression of performative sadness. My past," he sighed smoothly. "Honestly, Clara, I've just been unfortunate in love. I've actually been divorced twice. Both of my ex-wives turned out to be bitter, unstable women who were only after my wealth. When the money couldn't fix their internal drama, they dragged me through court and tried to ruin my reputation. I was too generous. That was my mistake. Twice. 2 wives in under 4 years? Red flags were no longer just popping up, they were blaring alarms in my head. A man who frames every single ex as crazy, while positioning himself as the helpless victim, is almost always the common denominator. The next morning, I couldn't brush off the heavy feeling in my chest. I called Sarah, a college classmate who now worked as a paralegal at a prominent family law firm downtown. Over coffee, I brought up Richard's name casually. Sarah's face instantly paled. "Clara, stay away from him," Sarah warned, leaning in closer. "I can't share private case files, but Richard Vance is notorious in legal circles. Both his divorces happened under insanely bizarre, high-control circumstances. Those women didn't walk away with his money. They left those marriages completely broke, emotionally drained, and financially ruined. Sarah's warning was the spark that lit the fire. I wasn't going to let my life be handed over to a predator just to satisfy my parents' social ambitions. I needed hard facts. Through a mutual contact in the local business community, I managed to get in touch with Richard's second ex-wife, a woman named Juliana. When we met at a quiet cafe 2 towns over, Juliana was hesitant, looking over her shoulder as if Richard might appear out of thin air. But once she realized I was being pushed into his trap, the floodgates opened. Juliana laid out the terrifying blueprint of how Richard operated. He doesn't just marry women. He runs a financial trap, she explained, her voice trembling slightly. He targets ambitious women, slow drips affection, and then convinces them to sign co-ownership agreements and joint credit lines under the guise of building a future together. Once you're legally tied to him, he funnels his business debts into your name, drains your assets, and begins a relentless campaign of psychological pressure. Juliana showed me bank statements, text messages, and legal filings from her divorce. Whenever these women tried to stand up for themselves or seek a separation, Richard would use his influence, high-priced lawyers, and fabricated digital trails to portray them as emotionally unstable and financially reckless in court. By the time the divorces were finalized, the judges awarded Richard full protection of his assets, while the women were left saddled with crippling debt and ruined credit scores. I spent the next 3 days putting together a comprehensive file. I gathered public land records, business registration filings for his shell companies, and copies of civil court dockets. The evidence was ironclad. Richard Vance wasn't a wealthy bachelor looking for a wife. He was a systematic predator who used marriage as a tax shelter and a financial shield to cover his massive business liabilities. Instead of taking my findings to my parents privately, knowing they would likely make excuses for him, the situation exploded faster than I anticipated. The following Sunday, my parents invited 50 of our closest family members, friends, and community leaders to an exclusive dinner at a high-end country club. When I arrived, my stomach dropped. Banners were hung, champagne was flowing, and my mother was glowing. Without consulting me, my parents and Richard had organized a surprise engagement party to force my hand publicly, assuming I wouldn't dare create a scene in front of our entire social circle. Richard stood at the head of the main table in a tailored tuxedo, holding a velvet ring box in his hand. My father tapped his glass with a spoon, drawing everyone's attention. "Friends and family," my father announced proudly, "tonight we celebrate a wonderful union. Richard has asked for our daughter Clara's hand, and we couldn't be happier to welcome him into our family." The room erupted into applause. Richard stepped forward, extending his hand toward me with a smug, triumphant grin that said, "You have no choice now." I took a deep breath, reached into my leather tote bag, and pulled out a thick, navy blue folder containing 50 printed copies of the dossier I had compiled. "Thank you, everyone," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the banquet hall. "Before anyone toasts to this union, I think everyone here, especially my parents, deserves to see the real contract Richard is offering." I walked along the tables, dropping the folders directly in front of my uncles, my parents' business partners, and the country club board members. Inside those folders, I continued, staring directly at Richard, whose face was rapidly draining of color, are the public court dockets, shell company registries, and financial records detailing Richard Vance's last 2 marriages. He doesn't want a wife. He wants his third financial shield to cover over $1.5 million in undisclosed business liabilities. Murmurs rippled through the room as people began flipping through the pages. Gasps echoed across the hall as relatives read the court statements from his ex-wives. Richard dropped his hands, his charming demeanor instantly shattering into pure, unadulterated rage. My mother buried her face in her hands, while my father stared at the documents in utter silence, finally realizing the horrifying trap he had almost walked his daughter into. The fallout from that night was immediate and devastating for Richard. Word spreads fast in high-profile social and business circles. Within 48 hours, Three of his primary investment partners pulled out of his upcoming commercial project. The country club revoked his membership, and local banks began auditing his commercial loans based on the financial irregularities highlighted in my folder. Rather than face the public humiliation and impending legal scrutiny, Richard quietly packed up his office, liquidated what assets he could, and vanished from our city altogether. As for my family, the rift was deep. My parents were horrified, not just by what Richard was, but by their own blind ambition that almost destroyed my life. I knew I needed clean boundaries if I was ever going to heal. I packed my belongings, moved out of the house, and rented a beautiful, modest apartment on the north side of town. I threw myself entirely into my architectural firm. Over the next 2 years, my life transformed. Without the constant weight of my parents' expectations or the shadow of Richard's trap hanging over me, my business flourished. I took on major commercial contracts, hired 2 junior draftsmen, and bought my very first home entirely on my own merit. I established a polite, distant relationship with my parents. They had learned their lesson, apologized profusely, and never brought up the topic of marriage again. Life was quiet, successful, and peacefully mine. 2 years after the country club disaster, on a rainy Tuesday evening, I was sitting on my living room couch reviewing blueprints when a sudden, aggressive knock echoed at my front door. I looked through the peephole and felt my blood run cold. Standing on my porch in a soaked coat was Richard. But he didn't look like the polished, suave millionaire I had met years ago. His hair was messy, his eyes were bloodshot and sunken, and his suit looked frayed at the cuffs. I didn't open the door. I spoke through the intercom. "Richard, leave my property immediately, or I'm calling the police." "Clara, please open the door," he shouted, his voice cracking with a terrifying mixture of desperation and mania. "You have to listen to me. You ruined everything 2 years ago. My firm went under. My creditors came after me, and it's all because of your lies." He slammed his hand against the wooden door frame. "I know you didn't mean to do it, Clara. I know you were having a mental breakdown back then. You weren't in your right mind when you made those fake documents. Just come home with me, Clara. Tell everyone you were sick, help me clear my name, and we can start over. I'll forgive you." It was mind-boggling. In his completely unhinged state, Richard had convinced himself that the only way to restore his ruined reputation was to force me to publicly claim I had suffered a psychological breakdown when I exposed him. He had even sent frantic messages to my parents earlier that afternoon, claiming he was back to save me from my mental instability. He wasn't here out of love or remorse. He was a desperate, drowning man trying to drag me down to save himself. I didn't panic. I didn't yell. I calmly pulled out my smartphone, set it to record, and stepped up to the window beside the door, keeping it locked securely. "Richard, listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice steady as steel. "I am recording this entire interaction. You have 30 seconds to step off my porch before the authorities arrive." "You think you can just walk away from what you did to my career?" he screamed, his face pressing against the glass. "Your career was built on fraud, coercion, and ruined lives," I replied coldly. "I didn't ruin you, Richard. Your own greed did. And if you take one more step toward my door, I won't just file a restraining order. I will send the remaining unreleased digital records of your shell companies directly to the State Financial Fraud Division." That was the turning point. The moment I mentioned the State Fraud Division, the frantic energy drained right out of him, replaced by pure terror. He knew I wasn't the scared, timid girl his ex-wives had been. I was a financially independent woman with the resources, evidence, and resolve to put him behind bars. Within minutes, the sirens of an approaching police cruiser echoed down the street. Hearing the sound, Richard stumbled backward off my porch, threw one last look of absolute defeat in my direction, and disappeared into the rainy night. The police picked him up 2 blocks away for trespassing and harassment. I officially served him with a permanent protective order, ensuring that if he ever sets foot near me, my home, or my office again, he will instantly face felony charges. Today, my life is entirely my own. I built my foundation brick by brick, and no predator will ever tear it down. Now, I'm curious about you listening to my story. What would you have done if your family tried to push you into a trap like this? Have you ever had to expose someone to protect your own life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.